for having me. It was great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Hello, everyone. So I see that we're all here, Allison. So maybe if you can change the screen, we'll get started. I just want to say as well, Chris, Aaron, and Sarah, it was just an awesome panel. So thank you again. I love the idea of proportionality and really defining diversity as well. I would say, when you talk about being qualified or being a woman in sport or being something outside the traditional white man, I often find people are very overqualified for some of the roles they have. So, never think that you can't be in a role or that you shouldn't apply because, there's a lot of research that men are hired for potential and other people are hired based on the work that they do in that moment. So definitely a timely topic, and thank you to everyone for that because that was very helpful. So next up we actually started this title with jobs outside of teams still in sports. And it got translated a few different times to be a little confusing. Then it was the good, the bad, and the 8-hour workday, which I'm assuming some people maybe don't only have 8-hour workdays as well outside of sports. And we have a really great lineup. So I'll just introduce you quickly and then we can jump into deeper bios. But we have Andrew Thomas, who is the Director of Data Science at SMT, former lead hockey researcher from the Minnesota Wild, and past consultant for multiple MLB teams. Next up, we have Dan, who is a principal data scientist at Zealous Analytics and spent 3 seasons with the LA Dodgers, most recently as the Director of Quantitative Research. Then we have Kanitha Mann, who is a data scientist with the NBA in basketball strategy and analytics group. Prior to joining the NBA, she worked in healthcare and marketing startups and received her master's in data science at UC Berkeley and her bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech. So thanks everyone for joining us. We have a really strong panel. So just to jump in a bit more, I'll go from where I see you on my screen. Maybe Dan, you can start a little bit more on your background. Obviously you've worked on a team, what that was like versus where you are now. What's your average day like at Zealous?
Of course, and thank you for putting this panel together, Megan. I'm really excited to chat about this topic with everyone. So Zealous was founded in 2019, and it's actually sort of ideally constructed to be a model or place for people who are interested and passionate about sports analytics, but maybe for whatever reason find a team environment not the best match for their own kind of personal priorities. And so we work with a network of professional teams in a couple of different sports and basically serve as an in-house full stack analytics platform. And so this is kind of a really natural extension of the experience that I've had with teams, of course, the Dodgers, but then even before that, some consulting arrangements with teams in soccer and basketball as well.
Very cool. And how about you, Andrew? Because you have a very similar background in terms of being with the Wild, and now you're in sport but not on a team.
I mean, I even went to the same school as Dan for some of this stuff, so it just tells you about that. So I was a professor of statistics for a number of years before I jumped both feet into hockey with the Minnesota Wild. Before that, I'd been starting up, I'm sure you've already heard this a couple of times, but WarOnIce.com with Sam and Alex to get into that space. The consulting work that I did in baseball was very similar to that kind of work that I ended up doing in hockey, and I'm sure Dan's done quite a bit of that himself too. The joining SMT was following my time with the Wild is because they had been contracted to do work with puck and player tracking. What interests me the most about working with them is that primarily they're a broadcast company. So a lot of what they do with their tech is putting together things that are going to augment any kind of TV show. The biggest example is, and then I always tell people when I work for SMT, is that they say, "Oh, I've never heard of them." It's like, "Well, have you watched a football game? Have you ever seen the yellow line for the first down?" They say, "Yeah." I was like, "Well, that's us. That's what this company's been doing for a long time." So they cover a lot of different scenarios with overlaying visual information onto broadcast, and that's a lot of what the puck and player tracking is supposed to bring to the NHL. And it put me in a position to be able to work with people doing data partly in real time, because a lot of this stuff has to get processed very quickly, but also being able to take a step back and look at data in other ways not just with hockey, but with baseball and golf and NASCAR in some places, to be able to say what kind of insights can we get from data to provide to people very quickly. And because I'm working with people in a very different way than I was either working in academia or working with a team, it's been a really great opportunity just to be able to broaden how I speak about the work I do to people who are experts but don't necessarily have the same training I do, which has been a common theme in a lot of different places that I've worked. So the fact that it's from the broadcast side is probably the most unique aspect of what I didn't know to expect necessarily going into it before I had become familiar with the company in greater detail.
Yeah, and not just, not as much exposure too on these types of jobs that rely heavily on data, but maybe aren't known as much for job seekers. Kanitha too, I love your background. Obviously, I'm a startup person, so really anyone who works in that environment, I know can survive anything. Can you give us a little bit of a taste of what your journey was like, what those experiences were like in healthcare and marketing, and now what you do at the MBA?
Yeah, thank you, Megan, for having me today. So I am what you can call a recovering engineer. When I graduated with my undergrad, I had done product development for a manufacturing company, and I left that space. And as I was going through my career, I've always done analytics for some sort of different industries. I've done B2B marketing, I've done healthcare, as you touched upon. And in that healthcare space is where I started doing some work with chatbots. This particular company wanted to improve the patient experience and treat them more like consumers rather than just patients going through a system. And I helped develop a chatbot that would help them get questions answered more quickly. And about 8 years after I had finished my undergrad, I went back to graduate school to make sure I got more education around data science, because that's what I really wanted to do. So stepping into the NBA league office is my first foray into the sports industry itself. And I really like being in this space because I work under the basketball strategy and analytics group. So we are tasked with making sure that the product of the NBA games is not only fair and competitive and exciting, but we're also tasked to try to think of ways to improve it. And in my role specifically, I do a lot of analysis about referee performance, specifically as it pertains to how the betting information looks for certain games and how, if any, potential match fixing were to occur, what data is behind that to support that or negate that and then investigate that further. So for me, I really like touching more about just making sure that the game is fair, it's competitively fair, it has integrity, so that the teams who are involved in the NBA can make sure that when they're competing, it's going to be a good product and that they can compete fairly.
Wow, that's super cool. And I know for, like I'm saying, a lot of people at this conference or in general have a hard time of knowing where to look. So maybe we'll start with Dan again. How did you find your role? How does your company recruit? And how would you suggest a job seeker that maybe wanted to work, at a similar role to you? How would they go about finding that?
Yeah, so the way I got involved with Zealous is a little bit unique because I've known Doug Fearing and Luke Bourne for a long time, and so it was sort of a natural connection to join them in kind of starting up Zealous. We do recruit pretty heavily on all of the major, job posting sites and things like that. So I have a 1-year-old in the background, we also, always try and have an active presence at conference and networking events and places like this. I feel as though, we are very similar to many teams in that the set of people who are trying to work for teams would also be good matches for the Zealous. And the advice that, comes up a lot for people who are trying to get started in sports analytics is really just to, participate in events like these and sort of put yourself out there. And that's usually a better path than just kind of hoping to submit, a resume to one of these job postings, because we are really actively engaging with the community and, trying to meet people and form connections. And that's usually a better way to stand out than, just being being a name in a series of resumes.
Yeah, and a bit more authentic too. And that's why like we wanted to keep this very low barriers to having people on this call and make sure that everyone can, participate. Maybe jumping to you, Andrew, then, you have an idea you want to work in sports, maybe not on teams. What's the best way to prepare for these other types of roles?
That's an excellent question that I have to put some thought into, obviously. But I think one of the most interesting pieces that people have brought to the table who want to work in this is there's two things that always come to mind. One is everybody that I've ever met who's really succeeded has had a deep interest in something, not necessarily in the thing they're eventually going to work in, but have taken a problem, made it their own, and dug in and done what they can with it. Think of at least a few people who've gotten jobs, both in teams and with other agencies, because they've built models because they wanted to answer some question. I know that people who've been hired at ESPN, for example, have been model builders for football, basketball, and so forth, because they wanted to know about player abilities, or because they wanted to know about some of the same thing. I know I've seen a few models out there for point shaving and match fixing, using various auditing tools that are out there too, which I think is just the neatest. Not necessarily looking for something that's going to be the same as what everyone else has done is kind of the second part of that. That if they've taken their own approach to a problem, that's kind of put them in a direction where they can at least find some more real estate that they might not have found otherwise. Now that I'm thinking about it, there's a kind of a third element that's a little more peculiar to SMT, which is I don't know a lot of people out there who have been more hardware based, but those are the people that I get the most out of talking to those people, because I don't have a large background in working with hardware. But for setting up the kinds of systems that we do right now, there are cameras, there are tags, there's components that go into it, and knowing how that stuff works in the physical world is a very different perspective than most of the people that I've met as a stat professor, as someone who's looked at models online, someone who's got kind of an appreciation for why things work the way they do, but from that perspective of, because I had to build it. I've always found that stuff the most interesting, because it's an angle I had not appreciated before. So if you're trying to find a place in a company or a team or any sort of place that does this kind of work, bringing a fresh perspective tends to be one way you're going to get noticed. And for me, at least, the hardware has been one of those ways recently where people have gotten my attention, because it's something I had not considered as strongly before.
So maybe more on the engineering side, even where people are not exactly like right in the data and analytics space, but they're very helpful to build these teams and have different types of roles. So stay open from what you have done in university to what career you could have or what company you could work for.
It's also, if I may say, it's also just a way of looking at data differently. If you're working on the hardware side too, that it's a fresh perspective.
Yeah, no, it's a good way to put it. Kaneetha too, I mean, coming from your background as well, I know we've heard from a lot of people about the technical skills, and you get the very obvious ones that translate no matter what space you're in. What do you think unique technical skills or something that someone could put on their resume CV that would stand out in your type of department?
I believe curiosity is the number one thing. If you are curious enough about what data set you're given and what problem you're trying to solve, you will be motivated to try to find ways to slice the data, to look at it from different angles, to make sure you're really doing a good investigative job in solving that problem at hand. And I will say from my own experience, I did have experience just working in a lot of different types of data. Healthcare data is different than the B2B data compared to the performance data I look at day in and day out nowadays. And knowing that they have different quirks, knowing that there's different ways, even though you approach them very similarly, that you do have to keep these quirks in mind, it's a good way to gain experience to add to your technical skills in making sure, yes, I can dig deeper into the data and I can try to get the analysis I want out of it. So I would say just being curious about the data at hand and trying to find ways to take a look at the data in different ways that you normally wouldn't think of is going to help you a lot.
Awesome. And jumping to you, Dan. Obviously, it's a bit of a different motivation. I know I always hear people say, I want to win a championship. I want to win the Stanley Cup. This is why I'm with a team. but what is life like off the roller coaster? What are the upsides to not being, up and down when your team wins and loses, no matter how good of a job you do?
Yeah, well, I think you put it perfectly that, that is the big kind of difference is just stepping off of that roller coaster. And there are ups on the roller coaster that are great. Obviously, being part of a successful team as the Dodgers were for the time that I was there. Unfortunately, I missed them winning the World Series, but we came close. That was really exciting and gratifying, and it's very rewarding to see things that you and your colleagues have a part of actually ending up on the field. But on the flip side of that, there are lows and losing streaks and times when it seems like you're kind of going against the grain. I think that the biggest struggle that people who work in teams, and baseball is probably even particularly this way, is with the work-life balance. As exciting as those playoff runs were with the Dodgers, it meant putting your life on hold for a month or however long it takes, which is another challenge, because you don't really know how long you're going to be playing. And then the year just has these schedule points, whether it be the draft, whether it be the trade deadline, where the work can be really, really consuming. And so, startup life as we are in now with Zealous, it does have its booms and busts, but those tend to be much more natural or traditional. We know when they're going to end. They never really carry over to the weekends. So there's certainly much more balance. It does come at the expense, both good and bad, of that emotional connection. But I think that the overall kind of lifestyle management aspect of that is something that at the very least, people can have the option to choose, hey, I really want to work in sports and be on that roller coaster, or there are these other opportunities outside of teams where the data is similar, the challenges are similar, but the work-life balance is something that's more manageable for me.
For sure. And how would you look at like time horizons? So when you were on a team, Dan, and you were, kind of preparing for the next opponent or whatever looked like, how is that different from now, the type of projects that you'd work on at Zealous?
Yeah, the team is the ultimate hamster wheel, where it's like, oftentimes you're only looking 1 or 2 weeks ahead. And it's really challenging as, doing data analysis and research in that environment, because in order to make a really big impact, I think a lot of us as data scientists feel, I need to be able to spend 3 months on this, and there's some chance that that fails, right? Like most things that are worth doing have some risk of failure. With Zealous, I think the success of our company relies on us being in a position to be able to take those kinds of long-term initiatives. At the end of the day, we are doing sports analytics, and so there's overlap with what teams are doing internally. And so if we're going to be providing value on top of that, we sort of need to step off of that hamster wheel and say, like, this is going to take 6 months, but this helps us be innovative. And so we get deadlines and crunches around those sorts of endeavors where, at the end of the day, we have contracts like anyone else. So to the extent that our long-term initiatives line up with those, that can create the crunches.
So different ebbs and flows in terms of what you're doing day to day. We'll jump into that with you too, Andrew. I know from going from War on Ice, and obviously you don't have to be specific about NHL teams, but how is that different going from working in the public? And I know a lot of people are trying to get their research out, trying to be seen by teams or other companies. How is that a different way to either have projects or tackle questions from working on an NHL team to the public work you did?
Well, one of the things that occurred immediately upon taking a job like that is you can't talk about it so much with the outside. And that always was a factor that kind of slowed me down in the beginning, because I liked being able to be in the public sphere and to be able to share with everybody. I don't know how competitive I ever was when I was in public with other people out there, but I was a professor beforehand, so I was in the spirit of sharing a lot of what I had done. And that spirit had been part of all the work I had done up until then. And so the attitude of having to change around and work with a new group of people who didn't have that same training as I did, but definitely had the same level of interest, was a change. And I think it's tough to be prepared for that if you aren't already coming into it. At the same time, one of the things that when you're in academia, in particular, is you can feel a little more alone. And I really wanted to join a team, a group of people who were working towards a common goal. And I was thinking about this, and I looked up the quote. I don't know how many people in your audience are West Wing fans. You might all be way too young for it. But there was a speech that Toby Ziegler gave to his team where he said, "We win together, we lose together. We celebrate and we mourn together, and defeats are softened and victories sweeter because we did them together." And that came out when I was in college. And that line had stuck with me. And when I took the job in Minnesota, that was kind of the spirit I was going with. Is yes, you will be winning and losing and going on that roller coaster, but you'll be doing it with a bigger group of people who have the same objectives as you, and in theory will support you through that because they also want to win, because that's the ultimate goal. That spirit, having moved on now to SMT, which is a different kind of, their victories are not our team victories. It's all about, producing something useful or finding, there's small victories and there's big victories, just like anywhere else. Finding a group of people who work like that, but being able to be a little more smoothed out because your schedule is not as predetermined about when those victories and losses come, like literally as they are on a team schedule. Adapting to that has been not too difficult for me because I had already come to something different like that before, but kind of it was useful to have a team preparation there with a bunch of people with different skills coming together, because now I'm in a technical environment where I'm working with people of an even broader skill set. And now you still got that team. We do it together. We win together, lose together. That aspect hasn't gone away at all from this new environment either.
Definitely, just a different type of team, I suppose.
Just a bit.
We'll go to Kanitha, because I know you've talked a lot about sports gambling, which is very, obviously a hot topic in North America, very interesting for a lot of people, but kind of in a broader way, and maybe we'll throw it to the whole group as well. Where do you see the industry going in terms of like technical expertise or like gaps where whether you're a student or you want to jump into sports, what does that look like in 2 years and 5 years?
It's interesting. So I think as far as where the league's going, we are looking more into things like wearable technologies, making sure that anyone who steps onto the court, whether that's the athletes or the referees, they're healthy and they're ready to go. Just having that data available. And then we really would like to leverage the tracking data that we have in order to track other things that would improve the state of the game based on how players are playing now compared to how they've competed years or so ago. So I think there'll be more interest into perhaps say like computer vision in order to facilitate that goal. But there's still going to be the bread and butter of just data analytics and making sure that you approach the problem the same scientific way in order to solve them.
Awesome. And Dan, that same question. I know Zealous is trying to push boundaries in all sorts of different sports. If you had to look in a crystal ball and tell students what they could focus on or how they could be a bit unique to get these type of jobs, what would you say to them?
Well, I think Kanitha hit the nail squarely on the head with talking about the future data and challenges in the sport, and those are very daunting challenges just from kind of an analytics and data science perspective, because some of this player wearable and kinematic data is sort of like massive time series of every joint on a player's body, and so it's even much more difficult, orders of magnitude more difficult than traditional like spatial tracking data. So I don't even know that we know like the tool set that's required to kind of make insights from that kind of data. But it seems like some background, at least in biomechanics and on the technical side, just examples of working with data that is massive and spatiotemporal, even more so than than player tracking. It seems like those skills are coming to the fore now that wearables and other types of kinematic and biomechanics data is coming into the leagues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was a great panel this morning on tracking data as well. It seems like there's a lot to do in the future on that. We'll jump to you, Andrew, too, as you were saying, you know, in the hardware space, where is your company recruiting? Where do you see gaps in the market in terms of like expertise? And what type of intern, student, mid-level person are you looking for?
Well, I won't speak for the whole company because there's lots of different things going on across the whole S&T space. And I know that when it comes to looking for new people and new interns, actually, I was thinking about this going back to the previous panel on diversity as well. A lot of the people who are trying to get attention in this are the ones who have been sure for a long time that they want to do this stuff. And I've often found that it's usually the people who are new to this that are bringing the most outside perspective that I think is the most valuable. So as I think about people we're trying to bring in, I'm trying to figure out the answer to that same question about how do you find the people who don't realize they want to be found or are trying to say it and we're just not hearing them, because both of those kinds of people are out there. I know that one of the things that that you Megan have been involved in with the Big Data Cup is making sure you're making it as accessible as possible for people to get engaged with that material. And as an NHL client, there's a lot that we can't necessarily do with the data that we're collecting because we don't directly own it. But that doesn't mean there aren't pieces of information that are out there with other companies or other places that we will pay attention to say, here are people who are now getting involved with this in a new way, and they're publishing their results. Why haven't we heard of them before? In some cases, because when I was a professor, we definitely had our share of students who were interested in stepping up. Who do we know that can make those referrals to those areas that we don't know about? Again, as a professor, you have others. When at Carnegie Mellon in particular, I was the one where someone said, oh, you want to work in sports? Go talk to Professor Thomas. Like, all right, that works. Finding that level of connectivity is kind of the easiest way to get through the pipeline, which sucks because not everyone has access to that. So anything you can do to democratize that, such as these open competitions, such as workshops like this, where it's low cost to attend, that's sort of what tends to put it on the radar for me, and where I tend to look for those people as well. But I'm also trying to make sure we stretch to areas that we haven't had previous exposure to, both in terms of first of all, on the diversity side. Second, on, again, the technology side, people thinking about data in ways that we hadn't before, because they'll probably if I'm already aware of a data scientist population, and now there's someone who's actually worked with physics or time series data, or has had some, even ecology in some places could be more interesting to these because they've thought about and worked with large data in other ways. I'm going to try and pay as close attention to that as possible if I'm pulling together a recruiting list. And I'm also going to share with people in my own company, hey, this person might not be right for us, but maybe they'd be right for you. And because S&T in particular is such a diversity of application, both on the hardware, software side across many different sports, I mean, we have creative people, we have software engineers, we have data people, we have dogs who are insisting that I take them out as soon as possible.
We have kids on this call.
I try to make sure that I'm not only listening, but I'm trying to share when I find people who I think were going to be of interest. And I hope I live up to that. I know that's a big challenge that we all follow, that we all try to match up to. But it's something we also have to actively practice. And so that's both an active and a passive process, as you well know.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Let's jump into some of the questions. And a reminder, if you have any questions, if you want to work in these type of companies, now is your chance. The first question, I'll have this open to whoever wants to answer, is what is the best way to get more education experience with player tracking data?
Do you want to pick a sport? I mean, that's a lot. I mean, that's a serious question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think your sport is important in terms of how much access you can get, right? So.
Yeah. I think there's stuff in the NBA that's out there that's been leaked one way or the other. And the questioner says, say NBA. Dan will almost certainly have a better answer to this because he's worked on it more extensively than I have.
Yeah, so I think there is a lot of public shot location data and that's sort of like the bread and butter of player tracking stuff in the NBA. And there are a number of places where that data is publicly accessible, and also where people have built open source tools for visualizing shot patterns, shot locations. In terms of other types of tracking data, I think a lot of that stuff is made available through some of the data analysis competitions, like the NFL Big Data Bowl is a prime example. At the NHL and NBA have similar events. Baseball, I know, is basically doesn't have any public resources for player tracking in baseball, which is frustrating and unfortunate, and it really closes the door for people, becoming more involved with baseball analytics. But fortunately, other sports have more opportunities.
And I will add, yes, Google could help find resources where enterprising people have obtained some of these just tracking data and are able to host it. But it'd also be good to get familiar what's involved in this data, why are they collecting it, and then just try to answer some questions you may have, like how fast are players moving from one side of the court to the other to get a play set up. Same for referees. Just try to just do some fun stuff with it. And if you can talk about it when you are going into getting a job, then it shows that you've already done some research and you have a passion for it.
I'll add to that just to say that, like, even if you think that other people might not enjoy the question you're trying to get into as much, it's still worthwhile to get into it for a few reasons. The biggest one being it's practice. Like, if you come in with a very simple question, it's the first place that you're going to use to put your data in the right shape that you want to have to answer that question. And that will lead to so many other things to follow. So I know that one that hockey people, the first question that most hockey people tend to look at because of data accessibility that I have talked to or encouraged is when to pull the goaltender. So this is something that's been going on for 40 years, at least in the academic space. It's a pretty well-defined question in that you're trying to get a result that's goal for you and not necessarily goal against you because you're going to lose anyway, but it's part of it. It's data that you could obtain from a number of different sources. It's a small enough sample that you can get some answers into it. And it's a widely enough studied question that you can have discussions about it with other people who are out there, no matter how deep into hockey you are, because almost everybody knows that the goalie is special, and you can at least start conversations that way too. So if you're trying to pick another question that's out there, because there are many, especially with something like tracking data, even a question as trivial as what's the fastest that a player skates in a game is a fairly simple physics question to answer, but it also opens up so many other questions to answer next. Even if you don't think it's interesting, lots of people do, and it's a great place to be able to get into and ask, okay, what's the next thing to ask about this, or what's the next quantity that I care about speed that I want to be able to dig into.
Awesome. And can we touch on a little bit on the education piece too? Because I know that comes up a lot when people have had 2 or 3 years of work, they maybe want to transition into a more technical role. When do you know what's right for you? I know, Kanitha, you said you went back to school, you wanted more data science. I know working in tech, some of the best coders will be self-taught as well. So it's really hard to know sometimes where the difference between lifelong learning and a formal education, and that can be a barrier as well. We've seen in baseball, the white Ivy League grad seems to get hired over and over again. So what education do you think is necessary, or what technical skills, and what can be self-learned in this space?
My personal story with this is that I had learned some coding in undergrad, but I did have to self-teach myself a lot just through fun projects that I could do. And as I started getting more and more interested in data science and learning about what models are available, how are people using the models, I found myself left with, I don't really understand a lot of the background behind this. And there is a choice that I made where I could study it on my own, or I could go back to school to get that environment in order to learn it better. And I chose school because I also wanted to pursue my master's at the time. So I just felt that there was a point where I had done enough with what I had learned so far from teaching myself or from doing it from my job, such as like working in SQL or working in R or doing Python, and decided, okay, I really need to beef up my background by learning statistics, by learning why certain models are going to be used better with certain data sets because of the capabilities or the limitations that it offers. And because I want to make sure that I can speak to those if I have to, that's how I made that step there. So that's what I did.
Awesome. And Andrew, maybe you could touch on this, having been a professor, knowing this space so well. If you could tell students, whether in graduate school or whatever level, what are some key classes that they really should take and pay attention to, even if they might be a bit daunting for people that don't necessarily like, the applied math or whatever?
This is probably unfair for me to say. They take every class that I taught because they're all great. But specifically, there are at least two that come to mind that I thought were really unique to Carnegie Mellon that I thought would do well outside of that space. The main one is there was a class pioneered by Professor Rebecca Nugent. I'm pretty sure she pioneered it. She's definitely made it her own. I got to teach it once when she was on maternity leave, and it was fantastic, in statistical graphics and visualization. The whole course was nothing about knowing how to display data with uncertainty in many different forms, how to communicate that to other people, and how to use the data gathering tools. In particular, we used R. How to use those tools in order to produce more complex, not just complex visualizations, but clear visualizations, knowing how to make sure this information was as communicable to other people as possible. That was a course I'd never seen pretty much anywhere else when I talked to people, and it was amazing to me how forward-thinking CMU was to set that up, and Professor Nugent in particular, because it opened the door to a lot of the other pieces, like statistical computing, like how do you set up regression models or time series or any of those pieces that followed. It doesn't really matter what you do with those if you don't know how to communicate those results to begin with, particularly when you're talking to outsiders. There's another class that I took when I was in grad school in statistics that is kind of the second piece of this that is also taught almost nowhere, but along the same theme. It was a class between the grad school and the law school about how to be an expert witness. And the reason it was so unique was because this, to my knowledge, had not been designed anywhere else. And it was a lawyer slash grad student. I don't know if Dan took this. Did you take it with Jim Greiner?
No.
This was a fantastic course because it set subject matter experts up again with lawyers and how to prepare for court if you were going to be challenged on your work. And what it taught me there and these are lessons that I try to pass on in other places that I teach, is the same lesson. How do you make your analysis as clear and interpretable to people who are smart but untrained in the work that you do? I don't know what exactly they duplicate this with in other places are, but the classes on communication, both with graphics and verbally, are the ones where I've seen the most bang for the buck happen after that. You can come in with mean comparisons and very simple statistical models and get a lot more mileage out of that and knowing what questions to answer next if you know how to communicate that to other people than you ever will taking a class on time series or more advanced statistical methods if you don't know how to explain why what you're doing is right or needs to be improved, or the same for other people.
Wow. Yeah, it seems like an awesome course. I don't know, Dan, if you want to jump in on the education piece, or what do you have sort of on, your list of these are the skills I want to learn next from a technical perspective?
Yeah, well, I'm really glad that Andrew highlighted data visualization, because it's one of these topics which is not only important for all the reasons Andrew mentioned, but where the barriers to entry are pretty low, just given that many of the best resources for data visualization are available kind of for free online and are in active development, as opposed to being topics that you need some fancy degree in order to even have access or a class around that. Another category that's similar to that is cloud computing, where it's so new that it's not a significant part of traditional education in statistics or machine learning or computer science. And a number of the tools and resources are freely available online, and there are many programs that are designed around educating professionals who are already on the job as opposed to people who are in school. And the cloud computing skills continue to be increasingly more and more important in sports analytics. And some of the topics we've talked about in player tracking, such as being able to use computer vision to isolate certain events. Google Cloud has tools that kind of automatically do this, so you don't even need to write any sort of modeling code. You can just kind of upload video and it will do scene detection and things like that. So learning more about cloud technologies and gaining experience with that is something where you don't need to be in some $50,000 a year education program to do that. And at the same time, it's one of the most relevant skills that you can have working in sports analytics today.
Awesome. So we have time for a couple more questions, so I'll get to them. What resources that you found do you recommend to help learn how to work with time series specifically? Competing in the Big Data Bowl, I understood the data, but felt overwhelmed trying to use it all, which I think we've all been there before when we're tackling a new project. So I guess the question's around resources. Where's your default? If you don't have a formal education, let's say in this specific area, beyond just Googling, is there a go-to place to help? Maybe we need Mike Lopez in here to jump on for the Big Data Bowl. We also have a couple other specific questions. So if someone wants to jump in the chat and write, that'd be great. But I really want to end too on, something that I think we kind of touched on, but didn't dig into more. And that is that it's very easy to get discouraged in sports, especially when you look at teams. There's only so many jobs, so many roles, and we might not think to look outside of these teams. But really, how did you deal with failure? Whether it was like applying for a role and not getting a call back, or unsure where to find a job in sports. What was that like? Because we tend to talk about the wins, but not necessarily the failures in our career.
It sucks. Never want it to happen. But I mean, the fact is, it happened. Like getting a good grounding in knowing how to take an L is pretty foundational to sports in general. But and so a good lesson to take into life. But I think as far as learning to deal with that, it's always tough to get back off the mat when something like that happens. I can think of at least a couple of cases in my past where I've applied for a job and not gotten it, or someone else's, or a hiring has been announced and I didn't even know the job had started. Then again, I don't know how many more jobs like that have appeared ever since. So, but it's still going to happen, especially as more people get into the field. Yeah, it sucks when that happens. It's the short answer. But I think I'd come back to it with the same West Wing philosophy. There is, if you've got a group of people that you're in with, who you support and who are rooting for you, it makes it easier when those problems come down, because you can get some better perspective out of it, and you can have people around to help you figure out what to do better next time. Because if you've got a group of people you're honest and open with about how these processes go, and you're willing to accept their feedback on that, it can usually help you turn it around better the next time. And often it is just a numbers game, and you shouldn't take it personally, because I remember hearing something, was it yesterday? Someone said there were 500 replies to a job opening in the NBA. I've heard numbers bigger than that for other jobs, because people are just getting in there, and it can be very tough to deal with just that fact of it. And sometimes if you're going through that, taking your experiences and making it public, the wording of that was poor, but like knowing that you got that kind of experience of going through the process and realizing what you got to do next can help you refine your public work just as much as it can help you refine what you're trying to do in the job side of things. So those sorts of experiences are going to be for the best, but make sure you've got a good group of people who will help you rally around if you can, because they'll soften the blow on that one.
Yeah, for sure. Everyone fails at some point. Kenitha, what advice would you give, best piece of advice for someone looking to work in your role?
I would say, again, just to go back to being curious. It's all about really following up on an investigation and making sure that you've followed up on all the potentials that happen. So you do need to be curious about what you're working with, and you want to actually solve the issues that are in front of you. And I will say too that back when I was younger, I had wanted to be in the sports industry, and I thought I could get in there due to like biomechanics and whatnot, and that didn't work out. So I changed industries and whatnot, and I'm here now. But that is to say, just be curious about what you're working with, and your passion will show.
Awesome. And thanks, Dan, for answering some of those questions. And I will leave this panel on that note. Be curious. There are lots of jobs out there in other industries that help support the sports industry, help support these teams. So definitely be curious on your job search as well if you're interested in getting involved. So thanks to Dan, Andrew, and Kaditha. It was really helpful. I think you all do an absolute wonderful job, and I loved hearing more about all your roles. Thanks again, and we will be back again shortly.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.